My name is Janice Jang, and thank you for attending Eclectics this morning. Okay, I have the great pleasure this morning of introducing our lecturer, Dr. Jason Shepard, who is a media law scholar, professor, and chair of the Department of Communications at Cal State Fullerton. Cal State Fullerton's communication department is one of the largest mass communications programs in the United States. His research examines the role of the First Amendment in American democracy, journalism, and culture, and he teaches courses in journalism and media law, history, and ethics. Before academia, Shepard worked as an award-winning journalist in Madison and Teach for America Corps members in New York City. As chair of the Department of Communications at Cal State Fullerton since 2014, Shepard oversees a department of more than 1,800 communications majors. Shepard's leadership has been recognized by several university-wide awards. He received Cal State Fullerton's University Leadership Award in 2015, and in 2016, Shepard was recognized with the Academic Senate's Faculty Leadership and Collegial Governance Award. So please welcome this morning, Dr. Jason Shepard.
Well, thank you so much, Janice, for the introduction, and it's an honor to be here today. I think this is my fifth presentation with OLLI. My first was my first year on the faculty in 2009, I believe, with Rick Pullen, the longtime dean of the College of Communications. And so I'm happy to be here today, although, you know, like many of you, I suppose, I wish this was in person. My days are spent on Zoom and email, and it's just not the same as in person, but there are some advantages, I suppose, and we will make the most of this. Let me jump in. I've got a pretty lengthy presentation. I've interspersed my PowerPoint slides with a number of video clips that I hope will break this up, so it's not just monotonous me talking at a blank screen. I will try to monitor the chat box occasionally. It's sometimes hard to talk and monitor the chat box at the same time, but if you do have questions as we go through, feel free to type those in the chat box, and hopefully I'll save some time at the end where maybe we can have a bit of discussion. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about how social media influences the political process. My research area is in the First Amendment, as Janice mentioned, and I teach in journalism and media broadly. The perspective that I'm going to bring today about social media in the political process partly comes from looking at how citizens use social media to learn about democracy, to participate in the democratic process. And I realized as I put this presentation together, the theme is a little darker than maybe I had wished. So I have a feeling that as we walk through this presentation, you may get a distorted impression that social media is nothing but terrible to the political process and democracy. And if we have some time at the end, we maybe could discuss that dichotomy. So I just want to start with that caveat that there will be things in the presentation that will make us worry, I think, about the state of political affairs, and it's not all bad. Well, so let's see. So the kind of key questions that I hope to focus on today include: what is social media and how does it work? What does research tell us about political views and social media? How has social media changed electioneering communications? By electioneering communications, I largely mean communications that are intended to persuade voters on a particular candidate or issue. Why do conspiracy theories flourish on social media? How are social media companies addressing problematic uses? And what laws and policies could improve social media? At the end, I'll share a list of about 5 or 6 documentaries that I recommend if you're interested in kind of further review of this material, and also 5 or 6 or 7 books. A really recent book published this year, kind of an anthology of scholars about the state of the field of research, book called Social Media and Democracy, the State of the Field and Prospects for Reform. If you're looking for a scholarly overview of this content, I highly recommend this book. Some of the themes that that the book covers and that I'm going to touch on today include how social media can increase or decrease political polarization through the creation of communication echo chambers, where people are communicating with only like-minded people. The book, and I will touch on a bit about how the computational structure of how social media programs work using bots and algorithms play a role in influencing the communications process. I'll touch on some misinformation, the sort of how misinformation can spread through social media, how social media has perhaps exacerbated and amplified hate speech, and then a couple of other themes running through the presentation, how political advertising has changed, and to some degree, how journalism has changed. Although despite my background and expertise in journalism, I have kind of left some of that out. That might be a presentation for a different day about really how journalism has changed as a result of social media. Also throughout the presentation, a theme running through will be, what can we do about some of the bad things about social media? What reforms might social media companies use? What we as users or citizens might demand? And what politicians and lawmakers can do about some of these problems? So there's kind of 4 areas where reforms, policy reforms, could play a significant role. One, in correcting misinformation that's disseminated on social media. 2, looking at liability reform for social media companies. Right now, social media companies are largely protected from any lawsuits based on the content that flows through their systems. And that was a result of an act by Congress in the 1990s, in the early days of the internet. More and more lawmakers are calling for reforms that might make social media companies more legally liable for some of the most terrible things that can happen on social media. Third area, I won't touch on this too much today, but it's certainly an area in scholarship that is growing, and that's comparative media regulations. Social media companies based in the United States don't just operate in the United States. And so the legal frameworks in every country potentially influence and impact what social media companies can do. And the legal jurisdictions and the boundaries of what law applies in what circumstance really is different in the global internet age. And then finally, the 4th area of reform is in the area of transparency. What can social media companies do to make their systems more transparent, so we can really understand what's happening in those areas. So the internet has changed how we communicate in so many ways. And, our students today are what we call digital natives. They have never known a world without the internet. Some of the younger ones have never known a world without social media or, the iPhone that gives you instant access to the world's information in your hand. When scholars looked at the promise of the internet in the really the early 1990s, when the internet started to become prolifically used, there was a lot of hope about the internet serving as an information utopia. How access to unfettered information would help democracy flourish by giving citizens more information and more access to communications. People who were isolated geographically and physically were no longer isolated, and the internet allowed for any speaker to have potentially a global audience. Certainly, there was a lot of hope that the internet and the free flow of information would disrupt authoritarian regimes, and that the internet was really a tool of freedom. None of these are false, and all of these things did and are occurring. But the internet is not a automatic creation of utopia. Again, my research background is in free speech and the First Amendment and censorship, and there was a fascinating series of essays published a couple of years ago by the magazine Wired, asking the question: Are we living in the golden age of free speech? And from a legal doctrine, Supreme Court decision kind of perspective, you could argue that we really are in the United States living in a golden age of free speech, where the government is regulating less and less of our communications. But there's been a shift to private companies, through internet companies, having unprecedented amounts of control over our communications. Again, I don't want to overstate things. Certainly in the history of mass communication, corporations and companies, private companies, not public entities, not the government, controlled private newspaper distribution, the telegraph, the rise of radio networks and television networks. But scholar Zepnep Tukeki, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, said that the internet really can be a dystopia. The most effective forms of censorship today involve meddling with trust and attention, not muzzling speech itself. And as a result, they don't look much like the old forms of censorship at all. The core business model underlying the big tech platforms, harvesting attention with a massive surveillance infrastructure to allow for targeted, mostly automated advertising at a very large scale, is far too compatible with authoritarianism, propaganda, misinformation, and polarization. So he was trying to get at this idea that the background workings of these internet companies are having much more power and control than maybe we think. And there's a lot more going on behind the scenes that we should be worried about. There's a documentary that just premiered on Netflix. Highly recommends it. It's called The Social Dilemma. I have like I said, I mentioned 6 or 7 documentaries at the end that I'll mention, but I've got some video clips throughout this presentation. So when we think about the companies that control and run the internet, we can see exponential growth in their market capitalization, in their footprint, in the number of employees, in their growth projections. We just look at the top 5 biggest internet and tech companies. 3 of them have a market value over $1 trillion. Apple being the largest, Microsoft, the parent company of Google, Alphabet, Amazon, and Facebook. So these companies, I mean, certainly Apple, if we buy an Apple, for those of us who are Apple users, they charge a pretty penny for their technology. So we can think, okay, we know when we buy a computer or buy a $1,000 iPhone, who's making money? Apple. But Facebook, it might be hard to think, many of us are users of Facebook and none of us are paying Facebook directly. Where are they getting their money? When we go to Google search, we're not paying anything as users to type in where the nearest Italian restaurant is. But these companies are making loads and loads of money off us. One of the ways that they do that is that they develop tools that we come back to using over and over and over again. I don't know about you, but I find myself reflexively picking up my phone to look at the latest news alert, or to check my Facebook feed of friends. And I do that by habit. Well, that's not an accident. We can see an exponential growth in social media companies in the last couple of years. You can see that most of these social media companies that are most popular today, Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, Instagram, WeChat, Tumblr, TikTok, Reddit, Twitter, none of these existed 15 or so years ago. And now, today, more than 2 billion people use Facebook monthly. Close to 2 billion people use YouTube. These are huge, huge numbers, and demonstrate this revolution in how we communicate with one another. When it comes to news information, about 18% of folks are getting their information from social media. 18% of people getting their news from social media. That keeps ticking up year, and year. Young people are getting primarily their news from social media. So there's no reason to think that this trend isn't going to continue, where social media is going to be the dominant form of fact-based information. You can see 48% of 18 to 29-year-olds are getting most of their political news from social media, whereas folks 65 and older, only 3%. So when we think about questions like, why does it feel like perhaps we're so much more polarized today than in the past? Well, we can start to look at, as one, not the only, but one explanation, where are people getting their news and information, and then what are they doing with that information? And we can see this huge, huge generational shift. Here, this data showing 47% of people 65 and older are getting their information from print sources. only 7% of people under 30 or under 29 are getting their information from print. So we're living in very different worlds in terms of where we're getting our news and information from. Interesting book that's now a generation old, Bowling Alone. Scholar, sociologist Robert Putnam identified, really first in an essay in 1995, and then he revised it for this book, Bowling Alone, in which he argued that there was a decline in community participation and civic engagement that's threatening the health of democracy. You know, going back and looking at this now, boy, is it you know, kind of ripped from the headlines. And this in 1995 and 2000, early days of the internet, social media was not a thing. Putnam argued that technology is one of the reasons why there's this decline in community participation and civic engagement. He argued that digital technologies facilitate the emergence of communities with like-minded individuals that are increasingly isolated from any challenging information, a process exacerbated by filtering technologies. Again, filtering technologies in 1995 were crude, rudimentary, nothing like the sophistication today. But Putnam was onto something in 1995. Cass Sunstein, another scholar, in a influential book of its time in 2001, Republic.com, also worried that democracy was being threatened by what he called the ability to get news from a daily me, where there are serious dangers in a system in which individuals bypass general interest intermediaries and restrict themselves to opinions and topics of their own choosing. So the daily me concept gets to the idea that we choose, when we are able to choose our news and information sources, we generally pick things that we agree with. We create these filtering bubbles by our own choice, and that doesn't expose us to contrary ideas, contrary views, other cultures, other ideas, other ways of thinking, and that's ultimately a bad thing for the health of our democracy. Well, fast forward to today, this daily me and this filtering idea, scholars have examined. Political communications is a field of study. Certainly political scientists also examine the role of echo chambers, sometimes self-selected, sometimes externally created bubbles. And in that, those echo chambers over time, the theory is, creates political polarization. There's sort of a conventional wisdom in the scholarship that politically like-minded individuals tend to find each other, self-select into communications networks. People are exposed to information in those bubbles that reinforce their own political views. Echo chambers isolate people from opposing views because of the filtering effects of ranking algorithms when it comes to online networks. So there's the self-selection component that limits people who are unlike you, but then there's the computational, algorithmic system behind the scenes that we're not even aware about that exacerbates those echo chambers. Filtering bubbles incentivize publishers for clickbait, pieces of information that are not substantive but highly emotive, and hyper-partisan content. So a lot of the research solidifies this theory that echo chambers exist and that echo chambers create political polarization. There are some contrarian views in the research, scholars are looking at and have and continue to look at, well, what happens when people are exposed to information that they disagree with? What happens when a Republican is exposed to Democratic views and vice versa? We call that in the scholarship cross-cutting interactions, when there's cross-cutting information of opposing or contrary views. Well, one theory is that cross-cutting interactions promote political tolerance. I have a missing word here. It should read, cross-cutting interactions should reduce prejudice and promote political tolerance. The research is mixed, and there have been a lot of experiments done that show sometimes cross-cutting interactions do encourage and create tolerance, but sometimes it drives people further into their original positions. So these empirical studies about the effects of cross-cutting interactions are mixed regarding the effects. So I bring this sort of 360 perspective overview of the state of the research about political polarization and the role of social media to say that there are beliefs that researchers have coalesced under, that echo chambers lead to greater political polarization, and that's a bad effect. It's a worrying effect. But there are also, there's still a lot to be known about how changes in communication habits on social media can or cannot improve and enhance political cross-cutting understandings and political tolerance. So in addition to the self-selection that comes when we choose who our friends are on Facebook or who we're going to follow on Instagram or Twitter, as I've alluded to a couple of times, there is a lot that happens behind the curtain that we don't know about that adds to that filtering process. There are computer algorithms that are created to that use artificial intelligence to create efficiencies. So computer algorithms track what we click on and then help give us content based on what the algorithms think that they want. Content filtering happens by user actions as well as by tech companies. When we think about artificial intelligence, it's not necessarily robots, although that's part of it. When we think about artificial intelligence in social media and on our phone, it can be things like voice activation, our navigation apps. When we go to Yelp and we want a recommendation, all of those tools are using artificial intelligence to try to maximize the user experience. When I go to Yelp and I want to know, I'll use the Italian restaurant example again, they're going to know what I've searched for in the past, where I live, where I've traveled, where my GPS in the phone is telling the app that I've been. If I've favored a particular restaurant in the past, it's going to know that. And the artificial intelligence that's developed over time through computational science is going to spit out its best guess without really even any, there's human programming that goes into it, but the computers themselves get better over time once they measure. If I keep going back to Yelp time and time again, and I'm spending more seconds on reading reviews, they're going to know that, and that review box is going to be moved up. So there's all sorts of things that are happening behind the scenes using algorithms and artificial intelligence that's filtering information to make my user experience more successful. So I've got 3 short video clips next that touch on various aspects of filtering and artificial intelligence.
So when you want to find something, a term, a person, do you Google it? It's really fast, no doubt about that. But are you getting the best answers to your questions?
The algorithm that they use to show us search results, it was written for the precise purpose of doing two things which make it inherently biased. And those two things are, number one, filtering. That is to say, the algorithm has to look at all the different web pages it has in its index, and it's got billions of them, and it's got to make a selection. Let's say I type in, what's the best dog food? It has to look up all the dog foods it has in its database and all the websites associated with those dog foods. That's the filtering. But then it's got to put them into an order, and that's the ordering. So the filtering is biased because why did it pick those websites instead of the other 14 billion? And then the ordering is biased because why did it put Purina first and some other company second? It would be useless for us unless it was biased. That's precisely what we want. We want it to be biased. So the problem comes in, obviously, when we're not talking about dog foods, but when we're talking about things like elections.
I am running for president of the United States.
Because if we're asking questions about issues like immigration or about candidates, well, again, that algorithm is going to do those two things. It's going to do the filtering, so it's going to do some selecting from among billions of web pages, and then it's going to put them into an order. It will always favor one dog food over another, one online music service over another, one comparative shopping service over another, and one candidate over another.
The Google search algorithm is made up of several hundred signals that we try to put together to serve the best results for each user.
Just last year, we launched over 500 changes to our algorithm. So by some count, we change our algorithm almost every day, almost twice over.
Now it's possible that they're using unbiased algorithms, but they're not using unbiased algorithms to do things like search for unacceptable content on Twitter and on YouTube and on Facebook. Those aren't unbiased at all. They're built specifically to filter out whatever's bad.
What happens is the best technical people with the biggest computers, with the best bandwidth for those computers, become more empowered than the others. And a great example of that is a company like Google, which for the most part is just scraping the same internet and the same data any of us can access, and yet is able to build this huge business of directing what links we see in front of us, which is an incredible influence on the world by having the bigger computers, the better scientists, and more access.
As a digital platform, we feel like we are on the cutting edge of the issues which society is grappling with at any given time. Where do you draw the line of freedom of speech and so on?
The question precisely is, what's good and bad according to whose judgment? And that's especially relevant given that these systems serve a filtering purpose. They're denying or allowing us access to information before we see and think. So we don't even know what's going on behind the scenes. The people who are designing these systems are building a gigantic unconscious mind that will filter the world for us. And it's increasingly going to be tuned to our desires in a manner that will benefit the purposes of the people who are building the machines.
What these algorithms basically do is they create bubbles for ourselves, because the algorithm learns this is what Peter Schweitzer is interested in, and what does it give me when I go online? It gives me more of myself.
I mean, it's narrowing your vision.
It's funneling my vision. It's leading me to a view of the world. And it may not be Facebook's view of the world, but it's the view of the world that will make Facebook the most money.
I'm going to shift now to talk a little about political advertising and how and why political advertising has dramatically shifted to social media and online advertising in the last few years. Well, you can partly see why through those 3 video clips. We can understand how content creators on social media, the people who are operating those social media feeds, are selecting content, creating systems that select content. And we, when we think about it from a consumer perspective, I want to be able to find my favorite Italian restaurant on Yelp as efficiently as possible when I type things in. But that same attention to user experience and psychology and technology can also be used to influence elections and campaigns. Data from the last 2 election cycles shows, the last 2 presidential cycles in 2012 and 2016 show that about $7 billion per cycle was spent on trying to influence the voters. About 2.6 billion in 2016 on the presidential elections. And I should say the $7 billion figure, these are just for federal elections. We're not even talking about state and local elections. And then also about, so not only do we have candidates and campaigns and political parties spending money, but we also have an increasing number of outside entities trying to influence the election. We call that in campaign finance lingo hard money versus soft money. 5.2 billion in 2012 was hard money, 2.1 billion was soft money. And there's certainly every expectation that in 2020, the percentage of soft money will increase. Soft money, the money spent by outside groups, wealthy individuals, super PACs, political advocacy groups that don't register as political action committees, have much more ability to spend money anonymously, and that trend has increased. So we can see over time, spending on elections 2000 was about 4 billion, touching 7 billion now. So over time, significant increase in expenditures on political advertising. Where does this money get spent and how does it get spent? In the 2016 election, we can see that roughly 44.7% was spent on broadcast TV ads. Historically, for the last 40 or so years, local TV advertising really was the bread and butter of political campaigns at a congressional or national or state level. 30-second commercials have been viewed to be very effective ways at persuading voters on political candidates. This graph shows that digital advertising was only 1.7% of total media spending in 2012 and 14.4% in just 4 years in 2016. Every indication is that that's going to continue to grow, that digital advertising is going to be where candidates are spending more and more of their advertising budgets. Again, you can see a forecast from 2015-16 and then a forecast of 2019-20, how much money is going to be spent on digital political advertising. $1.4 billion was spent in 2016, up 789%, a huge increase from the previous 4-year cycle. 40% of political advertising, digital political advertising, was spent on social media sites in 2016. Facebook was the biggest beneficiary. So more money was spent on Facebook than any other social media platform in political advertising. The Trump campaign was by far the most sophisticated advertiser on Facebook in the 2016 campaign. The Trump campaign spent half of its overall advertising budget on online advertising, including $70 million on Facebook advertising alone. So I'm going to shift now into some more kind of contemporary and current controversies. Here's a video clip from an Australian newscast, but it at least I chose this because it summarizes how savvy the Trump campaign was in using Facebook.
Next week, representatives of Facebook and Twitter will appear before the US Senate Intelligence Committee investigating Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Donald Trump's use of social media, Twitter in particular, has given him a hotline, not just to voters, but to the media as well. Without it, he doesn't think he'd be president.
I think I have 125 million people between Twitter and Instagram and all of them, and Facebook. I have a tremendous platform. So when somebody says something about me, I'm able to go bing, 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 and I take care of it.
While President Trump has courted controversy with sometimes factually inaccurate tweets and tirades and retweeting memes from dubious accounts, it's his campaign's use of Facebook that's drawing the most scrutiny. Trump's data guru, Brad Parscale, is giving evidence to the House Intelligence Committee on Tuesday, and he agrees Facebook made the difference in 2016.
So Facebook now lets you get to places, and places possibly that you would never go a TV ad. Now I can find 15 people in the Florida Panhandle that I would never buy a TV commercial for. And we took opportunities that I think the other side didn't.
And Brad says Facebook was more than happy to help the campaign.
Well, we had their staff embedded inside our offices.
What? Sorry, Leslie Stahl, you go ahead.
What?
Yeah, Facebook employees would show up for work every day in our offices.
Whoa, wait a minute. Facebook employees showed up at the Trump headquarters?
Google employees and Twitter employees.
They were embedded in your campaign?
I mean, like they were there multiple days a week, 3-4 days a week, 2 days a week.
What were they doing inside?
Helping teach us how to use their platform.
Facebook says they offered identical support to both campaigns, and they deny Parscale's claim that he vetted staff to only get Trump loyalists from Facebook. But while that's all interesting, the Senate Intelligence Committee really wants to know about Russia. In September, Facebook revealed more than $100,000 had been spent on around 3,000 ads from accounts they believed were Russian troll farm propaganda outfits.
I don't want anyone to use our tools to undermine democracy.
And a lot of those ads were pushing divisive issues like Black Lives Matter, anti-immigration crime stories, and a whole lot of fake news. Russians also sponsored YouTube channels boosting Trump or Bernie Sanders and consistently attacking Hillary Clinton. And Google says tens of thousands of dollars worth of ads were bought by Russians on Gmail.
Lost the US presidential election.
And state-run Russia Today television spent $300,000 on Twitter promoting plenty of anti-Hillary content.
What is WikiLeaks doing as they try to put Trump in the White House? Trump would not be permitted to win.
Because once you peel back the layers, Hillary Clinton is not just a mere wolf in sheep's clothing. She's an unabashed hawk, through and through.
But it's not illegal under US campaign finance rules for foreigners to pay to push content or buy online ads during an election. And it's all fairly small beer. The Trump and Clinton campaigns spent over $1 billion between them on online ads. But the ranking Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, Mark Warner, says that Russian spending was only the tip of the iceberg, and their ads were also incredibly well targeted to counties and states that mattered most, perhaps suspiciously well targeted.
Boy, oh boy, there seems to be an awful lot of unusual, to say the least, connections between people affiliated with Mr. Trump and Russians. And clearly the Russians were trying to influence the campaign and, as we know, had information that was discrediting the Hillary Clinton.
So I'm watching the clock, and I'm going to speed through some of this material, maybe a little faster. A couple of other things. We could have a whole lecture, mini lectures on the allegations of Russian influence in the 2016 political campaign. But one sliver that I want to highlight has to do with a company called Cambridge Analytica. And why I want to highlight this is it shows some of the back end significance of social media data that's collected about us and how that can be used to micro-target ads. So this company, Cambridge Analytica, was created by Steve Bannon, who was later a presidential advisor to President Trump. And it was a pretty typical political media company. Lots and lots of people work in political communications and develop ads to persuade people who are identified as persuadable on particular issues. Nothing nefarious about that kind of work. But Cambridge Analytica was able to, through a professor in the UK, get access to non-public data about Facebook users who had completed a quiz in Facebook. So Facebook has all sorts of apps, and other social media companies do, you know, are you more likely to be, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head and I can't, but this was a psychological quiz that people could take on Facebook. And they answered a lot of questions that were somewhat personal about, are they introverted, where they like to engage with communities and other people. Well, a professor was able to get access to this data that then was sold to Cambridge Analytica, who were then able to track and link friends of friends who was going to be more likely to be persuadable voters, people who were maybe on the fence. So this was a large scandal about how social media data that's collected about us as individuals can then be bought by political companies and then used for political candidates. This was the subject of a number of congressional hearings and administrative investigations. Facebook paid a $5 billion fine as a result of this data breach. And the inner workings of Cambridge Analytica was featured in a documentary last year that's currently on Netflix. I highly recommend it, called The Great Hack. So to be bipartisan, I also wanted to include an example. The Democrats do this too. There was this fascinating example in Alabama in the 2018 Senate election there, where former Senate candidate, I believe Roy Moore, was running, and a outside group not affiliated with the Democratic candidate, Doug Jones, who ultimately won, this outside group created these Facebook ads suggesting that Roy Moore and his supporters wanted to ban alcohol, have Alabama become a dry state again, and micro-targeted to people who they thought would be moderate, business-oriented Republicans who would not want, for financial and economic reasons, Alabama to become a dry state. 3 million people saw these ads that were paid by this Democratic outside group. Now, this was fake. There was no suggestion that Roy Moore was going to support new laws making Alabama dry. So this micro-targeting based on Facebook user data is happening at on multiple levels and in various scales. There is a bill that has been introduced in Congress called the Honest Ads Act that would help apply federal and state campaign finance laws that exist for things like broadcast TV ads, print newspaper ads, to also apply to the internet. Right now, in so many ways, the internet's kind of a wild west of regulations, and the law, through either legislation or administrative law, just can't keep up with the changes in the technology. I want to touch on 2 or 3 other themes really fast, and then hopefully leave at least a couple of minutes for questions and discussion. So we've talked about the role of the ways that social media companies work in ways that we maybe don't fully understand, using filtering and algorithms and artificial intelligence. Also how that has been somewhat weaponized by political campaigns to influence voters. A couple of other things in the mix that make this really messy. Simultaneously, in the last decade or so, the last certainly 5 or 6 years, we've been living in what some scholars have called a post-truth era. Post-truth, I believe, was a word coined or entered into the dictionary in 2015. Some common themes of this post-truth era: conspiracy theories flourish. In the 2016 election, one study found that stories identified as fake news, and we're saying real fake news here, stories that are false, had more shares, likes, and comments in the last 3 months of the 2000 presidential election than stories from real mainstream media outlets. We've certainly seen the weaponizing of the term fake news, and sometimes a purposeful attempt to confuse consumers about what's real and what's not. We've had a unprecedented critique and criticism of mainstream journalists as being the enemy of the people from the president. Just a few examples of conspiracy theories that have flourished. Alex Jones, a right-wing media commentator, had pitched for many years that the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012 that killed 20 little children in a school was faked. Certainly, when you listen to and see video of the parents whose children were killed, this was not a faked mass shooting. But Alex Jones spent years pushing this conspiracy theory. That was kind of one early example that was really alarming to scholars about how can conspiracy theories like this take hold, gain followers, and have serious impact. In one example, a woman was sentenced to 5 months in prison for harassing the parents of these dead children. Another example that you might have heard about, Pizzagate, involved a conspiracy that a pizza shop in Washington, D.C. was the home base of a child pedophile ring run by Hillary Clinton and her campaign manager, John Podesta. It seemed a ludicrous conspiracy, but this began to proliferate through social media and conservative alt-right media, leading to a man bringing a gun and firing it multiple times inside this pizza restaurant, thinking that he was saving children who were locked in the basement. Certainly the police came. There were no children in the basement. And a man was arrested and said that he had, well, read about this and heard about this in the media, and he was wanting to be a hero. Another example of phenomenon in media has been the rise of what we call deep fakes. Digitally altered videos depicting real people doing and say things that they didn't do. Deep fake videos, so distorted, computer-generated video that to our naked eye seems real unless we know more information, is a real worry especially in days before an election. If people are seeing things on social media in video form, they're more likely to believe it. This scholar here says, creators of deepfakes count on us to rely on what our ears and eyes are telling us, and therefore lies the danger. Under assault will be people's reputations, political discourse, elections, journalism, national security, and truth as the foundation of democracy. How do deepfake videos work? Here is a quick example.
Know this footage. I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. But what about this? I will not be resigning the presidency at noon tomorrow because I am not Richard Nixon. In fact, I'm Jake Ward. I'm a television correspondent. And the fact that my face can be put onto the late president's and do a pretty good job of fooling you, well, that's a sign of just how much trouble we're all in. You see, I would never say these things. Someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. Made by a hostile nation, just for laughs? It doesn't matter. Deepfakes are good enough to fool anyone. So good that Twitter, Facebook, Google, and both political parties are scrambling for ways to fight them.
I believe that this is the next wave of attacks against America and Western democracies.
Hani Farid is one of the world's top experts on deepfakes. And now Facebook has come to him, even though he's a vocal critic of the company, to help it develop tools for detecting deepfakes.
We all have these little tics, if you will.
Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. The trick is teaching computers to spot patterns in how public figures speak.
President Trump, when he puckers his chin, his mouth is closed. And when his mouth is open, he doesn't pucker the chin.
Wow. So this pattern is his fingerprint.
Exactly.
Farid's algorithm is built to help researchers and news organizations like NBC spot deepfakes of candidates in the 2020 presidential race by learning their patterns.
And every candidate, Senator Warren, Joe Biden,
right?
You know, they all have their own little tells.
Farid says his system is a temporary victory in an endless war between hackers, journalists, and academics. To preserve our trust in real footage, Farid says companies should build phones that digitally watermark what we shoot, so it's easy to see what's been altered.
I actually would like to see the Apples and the Androids of the world eventually incorporate this into the native app.
So you're talking about not just authenticating video after it's been shot, you have to authenticate the camera.
Exactly.
A warning as fake footage of public figures goes viral.
Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president.
Pictures may no longer speak for themselves.
So the state of California passed a law last year to ban the use of deepfakes in the days before an election, defining deepfakes as prohibiting the distribution of materially deceptive audio or visual that seeks to injure candidates and sway voters within 60 days of an election. Hate speech is another phenomenon. The text isn't showing on my screen, but there have been a number of very disturbing mass shootings that have been linked back to extremism that has been developed on social media. So companies are trying to police hate speech and extremist speech on social media, but sometimes there's a fine line of what crosses that line to being speech on social media or the internet that needs to be removed or, in some views, censored. Congress has been trying to pass a national commission to examine the rise of extremists and how social media companies and policies might be reformed. Finally, there have been calls to revise social media companies' use of a provision in law called Section 230 that was passed in the early days of the internet in the 1990s that gave internet companies immunity from lawsuits about material posted on their website. So people can sue, if somebody posts on Facebook something that's false and defamatory, people can sue that person for libel. They can't sue Facebook. And that has given these social media companies significant power to not take down offensive information. More and more of these examples has led people of both parties in Congress to call for revisions of Section 230.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. You always provide us with food for thought, and we appreciate you returning, and we look forward to your next presentation for OLLI. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy.